to open up with our first speaker.
Good morning and welcome. Let me add my welcome to Shirley and Chuck's and greetings from St. Lawrence University. Just a couple of announcements as we get started. The bathrooms are just outside. Oh, that's from last year. Good morning. So we get to kick things off this morning with a great keynote from Meghan Chayka. Meghan is co-founder and CEO of Stathletes, a Canadian hockey and sports analytics company. In 2019, she was listed among Hockey News' top 100 most powerful and influential people in hockey. And in 2020, The Athletic listed her in their Hockey's 40 Under 40. And she was the driving force behind the inaugural Big Data Cup in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Meghan to give our opening keynote.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. And I will just say again, thank you both to Shirley and Michael. This conference is so amazing. And to give you an idea of, how things transpire, I think it was the second or third Ottawa conference. I pitched them to do a workshop on the Friday night. And I actually asked one of the women who I met in the washroom at the Vancouver Hockey Analytics Conference to help me out with that workshop. And this has to be 4 or 5 years ago. And the name of that woman is Namita, who we will actually see as one of the college judges coming up. So, in better times when we can be together, you never know, or bump in or meet someone. Now we're virtual, but it's always awesome to have such a great group. And, thanks again for hosting such a great conference. I'm hoping everyone can see my slides and all is good. I will start off as well, just touching, everyone did a great job, reiterating that we have another college final tonight. We'll have the winners this evening. Almost half of the submissions were on women's hockey data, and this is really important to me. I think there's a huge market in terms of not only women's sports, but women analysts and other executive positions. As we were saying before, there's a lot of business analytics jobs as well. So, there's a ton of different work, I think, that will only grow in the sports sector, in the data and analytics and sports tech environment. Also, I will be adding the Isabel Cup that's on NBC this weekend of the NWHL to the Big Data Cup set. Please, I've had a ton of questions. Do research, post blogs, submit your papers to different conferences. I want, especially the women's side, to be talked about and for us to progress understanding of that game. I tried very hard to get more women's data as well, so I hope we can do that in the future too. And we have $4,000 in prizes and so much NHL gear. Thank you to everyone who contributed. I'm completely overwhelmed by the support. It's been wonderful to see not only all the research, but knowing that, the majority, pretty much all NHL teams saw your submissions. You had at least a few people read them very closely. So thank you again to all the people who said it was their first time they've ever done a hackathon. I think, it's always hard taking that first step, but, we're in a pandemic, so might as well use the time to develop yourself and do something new. I just put together a very short video to show just some fun ways that you can look at data, some different ways that, you can see and visualize various data points that we collect at Stathletes. It was a very small sample. We fought internally a lot, so it took a bunch of time to figure out how we could translate our data into very usable, low barrier to entry, label things so they made sense for any sort of beginner. Typically we have a lot more complex data feeds and data that comes out of different technology like this. You can see that this is just a one camera feed where it ends and stops, panning at a very specific play. Curious as to if people would know what this goal was. I feel like it was a pretty big goal of the season, but maybe I'm biased being in Ontario. Most of Toronto is shut down right now. So we don't have too much to do other than watch hockey. But you may be able to see that there was a goal very close to the net. This is actually an overtime goal. and just put together a little clip to show different levels of tracking and different data sets. And there's Austin Matthews, of course, scoring. So that's just a very fun overview before we get into a bit more of a topic. I think too, we have Twitter going. So if you want to hashtag OTTHAC or you want to drop your Q&A, I will try to get to them after. I know I'm first, so I don't want to go too long or over time, but I want to make sure I can address some of that. So anyone who is invested in hockey analytics is familiar with score effects. Here we have a popular illustration of this phenomenon showing how trailing teams see an uptick in shot rates while leading teams see their shot rates decline. Due to data limitations, investigation into the causes and nuances of score effects has been lacking. Well, why do trailing teams generate more shots? For one, they excel at entering the offensive zone with control of the puck, doing so 35% of the time, while leading teams only manage a controlled entry 32% of the time. Not only that, but when they instead choose to dump the puck in, trailing teams are much more successful at establishing possession. They manage to succeed in gaining possession on 27% of dump-ins versus 22% for leading teams. When exiting the defensive zone, we see a similar picture where trailing teams better maintain possession of the puck. As a result, teams chasing a lead tend to gain a territorial advantage, amassing 54% of puck on stick offensive zone time. An interesting note here is that they also appear to be less selective when firing the puck, evidenced by their elevated shot rate per second of the O-zone possession. This hints at potential differences in shot quality across score states, and we'll return to that topic shortly. One last really interesting tidbit relates to puck recoveries. To the right, areas shaded in red represent regions where trailing teams improve at recovering loose pucks compared to what they typically manage when the score is tied. At the very least, we can see that trailing teams get an edge in recovering pucks. However, subtle across the entire ice surface. Even in the slot, an area where leading teams collapse to strategically protect trailing teams get slightly better at reeling in unclaimed pucks. The fact that trailing teams excel at recovering pucks everywhere could be evidence for a psychological advantage, perhaps born out of desperation. And I think that's one element that people sometimes bring up in hockey analytics is how do you think of like the mentality of the player. So I think this is an interesting slide to really think about that. So when we take a look at score effects, as they pertain to expected goals, things start to get interesting. We still see an advantage to trailing teams, but it is significantly smaller. The difference in outcomes between shots and expected goals implies a steep drop in shot quality for leading teams and a sharp rise in shot quality for trailing teams. So this raises the question, why? Well, we can explain away a good deal of those shot quality differences by focusing on rush opportunities. And if you haven't seen my MIT speech or my Columbus speech, I talked a lot about that last year. So I won't go too much into that, but if you want to pop into that presentation, I really go into rush chances for and against. Here, notice that shots taken in quality rush situations like breakaways and 2-on-1s actually favor leading teams. This leads us to define an interesting score effects peculiarity. Almost got that word out today on a Saturday morning. The rush cycle trade-off. When we split expected goals based on how they were created, so off the rush versus off the cycle, we get two completely opposing relationships concerning the score. Cycle expected goals follows the classic pattern that we're very familiar with, where trailing teams get an edge. But in terms of rush expected goals, the reverse occurs, where leading teams are the ones who see a significant increase in offensive output. And I think if you're looking at any slide during this presentation, this is probably a good one to focus on. I was a bit surprised, not completely. I mean, it does intuitively make sense, but for me, I think it was just a very clear indication of the narrative in terms of what I'm trying to say in this presentation. So I'll stick on it for a second longer in case everyone wants to get a look. So the question really is, when you're talking about explaining leading and trailing results, given that score effects are reversed for rush and cycle production, is it possible that differences in team style, cycle versus rush, partially explains why teams respond better or worse than expected to certain score states? As it turns out, yes. The answer is yes. And I will give some good examples so we can understand that a bit more. We can begin to better understand how teams react differently to score effects by predicting trailing and leading results by using results from when the game is tied. When predicting expected goals for per 60 minutes among trailing teams, we find that teams who excel at creating offense off the cycle when tied happen to produce the most offense when trailing. If you think about it, this makes sense given that trailing score states are especially conducive to expected goals generated off of the cycle. An interesting consequence of these results is that successful rush-oriented offenses are likely to underperform offensively when trailing. Conversely, when we are trying to predict how teams will perform defensively when trailing, we find that the most successful teams are those who limit cycle XG when tied and reduce the overall rate of rush chances, both for and against. We've seen that leading teams take full advantage of the counterattack to create odd man rushes. It perhaps appears that teams who play a high risk, high reward style, don't know any of those in Toronto, tend to get burned quite often when attempting to mount a comeback. Now, let's take a crack at explaining team results when leading. Offensively, teams who excel at creating off the rush when tied happen to excel offensively when leading. Not exactly surprising given what we know. That said, it helps to have a decent cycle game as well. Okay, let's look at defense. Leading teams tend to spend plenty of time in their defensive zone. And so, as you would expect, the best predictor of defensive success when leading is the limiting of cycle XG when tied. So let's get into some tangible examples. All right, this is the 2019-2020 St. Louis Blues, dominant off the cycle, but as it turns out, a rather poor rush team. So a fairly good example for this. To the right, we have both the Blues observed XG results and predicted XG results using two different methods. The gray line reflects their expected trailing results given their results when tied, assuming that they would react to score effects like a typical NHL club. The green line reflects their expected trailing results given their playing style when tied, thus making use of our newfound knowledge about how rush and cycle results predict responses to different score states. Notice that we predict a much stronger trailing performance form from the Blues than we would if we were to make the naive assumption that they are just your typical NHL team. This makes sense since now we know that it doesn't matter that the Blues can produce off the rush when tied, since they wouldn't be able to leverage that skill when trailing anyways. If you look at the blue line, it turns out that the Blues did in fact overperform as a trailing team last year. All right, so now a different team, different angle. The Devils are a very different team than the Blues. I think we can all agree on that. The eye test tells us that too, so let's look at the numbers. Last year, the Devils struggled in all areas except at creating off the rush. So pretty good example for this, for off the rush, where they were actually quite outstanding. But as we know, that won't help them much when chasing leads. And what we find is that they underperform by a significant margin when trailing last season, in line with what we learned about rush-driven teams earlier. So, score effects influence shots and possessions to a greater degree than they do expected goals. Trailing teams have an easier time generating chances off the rush, but a harder time creating quality rush opportunities. The reverse is true for leading teams. Cycle and rush teams do not react uniformly to score effects, and scoring first is likely even more important when facing a rush-dependent opposition, as they can be ill-equipped, like we saw before with the 2019-2020 New Jersey Devils. To take advantage of those trailing dynamics. So, we had a lot of debate on really good topics and a bit more rigor in terms of what we wanted to present on. But we thought this was sort of a unique opportunity that we could talk about score effects with all of the data that we have. As I said as well, rush chances are really interesting, and I found that versus cycle to break that apart was, gave results that, although intuitive, the data really backs it up, and you start seeing these interesting results from different types of teams. Of course, there are a lot of teams in the middle that are, good in various ways at both rush and cycle. And these are some of the teams that, I didn't highlight. I definitely went for the both opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of this presentation. So I would love to see more research on this type of topic. And I hope that, you all enjoyed a really brief interlude from what I usually talk about to go with that as well. I just want to note to close this off that, thanks to Allison for helping so much with all the Hannix and everyone that has shown up and, connected during this pandemic. Even with the Big Data Cup, I know some people think that, they are an inconvenience, but I love talking to people. I love, sharing the data that we can and seeing the community grow. I think this should only just be the beginning of more and more. And I think Shirley and Michael said earlier on the call, when they originally looked at, doing this conference, they thought maybe 20 people would show up, and we have over 400 today. So I think it speaks volumes about the group and where analytics and data is going in the future. And I think with more and more data and some of it being public, there's incredible people and work in the public that do this research. So really excited to see some of the crossover from NBA and NFL that we were able to see in the Big Data Cup. And I take complete responsibility for any of the delays, as it was a bit of a slug to try to get data out in a meaningful form. So we hope if and when, hopefully when we do the Big Data Cup again next year, you will have a lot more time as the NFL gives people 3 months. So the quality and overall quantity within that very short time and the judges turnaround, I just want to say I'm incredibly appreciated. And for all of the people that put in office hours, that donated, and that took the time. It's a very incredible community, especially at the NHL level, that, I admire and respect. Everyone who pitched in and helped, and especially the NHL League for their support. Both the college and open judges have league representatives as well. So it's just amazing to see everyone engaged and helping. And I'm just very thankful for, everyone's support and for what we've been able to accomplish. So that is it for my keynote. I will jump in if there's any questions. But I really appreciate everyone's time, and I know this will be an absolutely wonderful event. Can't wait to pop back on for the announcing of the winners. Thank you again. Please enjoy your day.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Megan. Let me remind everybody that we're taking questions through the Q&A there. And that we're being recorded. I'm actually going to ask Megan a question here while I let everybody else start the Q&A. So, Megan, could you go back to your takeaways slide. First of all, awesome and very cool stuff here. Meghan?
Yes, I'm working on it. Sorry, I unshared
no worries. No worries.
Takeaways? Yes.
Yeah. And so, there's two parts. So this is the trailing team having an easier time generating chances off the cycle. Is that because the trailing teams are pushing harder, or because the leading teams are holding back, or is that something that you're not able to tease out of the data?
Yeah, we're not quite able to tease it out, but I think it goes back. I think it was one of my initial slides that talks about puck recovery on dump-ins, that trailing teams recover the puck more often. I think it's on this one. Ozone dump-ins, yeah, 27%, the trailing teams actually recover the puck, whereas it's only a 22% rate with the leading teams. So I think that's some indication that there is either more hustle or something is occurring that leads for trailing teams to get the puck back. And this just impacts their ability to have more shot attempts in the offensive zone too, because they have the puck more. So I think that's something that needs to be explored further, but that was our initial thoughts on it.
Awesome, thank you. Let me go to one from the Q&A. This data is all 5-on-5?
Even strength.
Say again?
Even strength?
Even strength.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Because I see, yeah, no, it's not when the goalie is pulled. I mean, it's a very small amount of time typically in games, but yeah, this would be all even strength.
Awesome. So another question that we've got for when the game is tied, which is better at creating chances or for creating expected goals, the rush or the cycle?
I think I had a slide on that as well. It's kind of in between. So both rush and cycle, you can see when it's tied, they basically we put it at 0 for both the shots and expected goals for the calculation. So it's only diverges as someone scores either up or down. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of the interesting thing about this study is the dynamics change in terms of whether you're leading or trailing. It's not necessarily like one team is better than another. And the interesting thing is we do see, a Tampa Bay Lightning that's very good off the rush win the Stanley Cup. And then we see the St. Louis Blues that's very good off the cycle win the Stanley Cup as well. And I think sometimes in the NHL, teams try to copy who wins the Stanley Cup, but it's been interesting to see different styles win in different ways. So it's not to say that one is better than the other, but when they're leading and trailing, if they're very heavily weighted one way or another, we see big advantages. So there's a lot of teams that are in between too, which I sort of alluded to. And actually even Toronto is pretty good off the cycle as well. So they're not so extreme as the New Jersey Devils. And I think you'll see a lot of teams that are at the top of the standings are good on the cycle and will recover pucks, be very good at getting the puck back to when they dump it in.
Awesome. Thank you. Another one for you. Is it possible that the increase in controlled entries and dump-in recoveries simply due to the leading team deferring to low percentage plays more often?
Yeah, and I mean that's probably a good observation. And I'd have to do a bit more work to figure out exactly if that's the case. But clearly when you're leading, you're not willing to take as many risks, and you're trying to be more defensive minded. And I think that leads to these type of plays as well. So there's for sure some explanation there, but I think there's something more with these results and how extreme they are.
And I have a question that follows on that. How much is it dependent upon the period? I'm
That's
thinking
also a
of,
good
right,
question.
a team that's down one, how are they behaving differently in, say, the beginning of the second versus the middle of the third?
Yeah, and I think, I looked at that data very briefly. So there are some variations. Obviously, as there's less time, teams get a bit more desperate to score, especially if they're trailing. But with that said, it's not as big of a difference as I thought it would be. I didn't put in that visualization as it wasn't, it was not as interesting, I think, for a presentation. But if you're talking about like the nuances, for sure, there is some difference from the first to second to, third to last 2 minutes of the third, obviously, in terms of what that looks like.
Cool. One more here. How do you think that teams can use this in terms of scouting their opposition?
Yeah, I mean, for these very extreme examples, obviously, it's a bit easier to do. So the nice thing, the good thing about the NHL is the quality of competition is very high. And, at any given night, any team can beat each other. So it's definitely better in leagues where there's a lot more variety in terms of what they're good at and the quality of players. With that said, we actually track all the data that we track in the NHL the exact same, and Stathletes tracks in 22 leagues worldwide. We do a ton of the draft, a ton of scouting, really have a huge footprint in Europe and Russia. So we can compare all of this same modeling that I've done here on NHL data with any league you want in the world, essentially. So that's where it gets interesting. And I also do apologize to the Big Data Cup last night. I know some people wanted the full leagues, and yes, your models would look a lot nicer with full league data, and there'd probably be even more interesting results. So hope to get that to people in the future for the Big Data Cup, because I think that's a missing link to understanding this better.
Yeah, I think that's really great. Thank you for that. So, we've got some questions in the chat in terms of, if you look at other leagues, how big are the differences you're seeing in teams? For example, just, St. Lawrence playing Division I, right? Hockey in
Yes.
the US. How big are those differences top to bottom in those leagues relative to the NHL?
I mean, it varies year to year. Obviously, there's some years where, teams in certain leagues just I don't want to say they don't try, but they've just like gone for a run and tried to stock up. And then there's other leagues where, or other years where they just know based on the dynamics of the leagues or different rules that they're not that great. So, totally league dependent, but for sure we see a lot of variation in some of the Russian and European leagues too. So that's why collecting all the data is like really important, and to having full seasons and having, we have 3 to 5 years in a lot of these leagues as well of data. So that historical data set is really key in answering those questions, because without that, you're just really guessing, or you're using a sample size that may not be adequate for modeling. So I would say that, yeah, I mean, the NHL, the quality of I don't even think people understand how good the worst NHL player is, right? Until like they show up at a beer league game and it's, it's embarrassing. So I would always keep that in mind when you're trying to criticize players, that they were likely a star in, the CHL, OHL, and you weren't. So yeah, they're pros, and they're getting younger and faster and stronger. And I think both analytics, but also like sport technology and the sports science side is just progressing at such a rapid rate, where player development is just getting better and better. And I think we really see that, whether it's with, the US development program. We see that obviously at Hockey Canada with some of our CHL and NCAA players. And I mean, we are big St. Lawrence fans too at Stathletes. So I did throw in a couple St. Lawrence games. I don't know if anyone picked that up. I saw maybe 1 or 2 papers wrote about it, but we love college hockey too. And, there's a lot of really good players and a lot of good competition. So excited to see some of those teams be able to proceed even through COVID. So a lot of good quality hockey out there. And I think, having that data and like seeing like the MHL and all of these other leagues in Europe that typically we can't even get scouts to now, right? So analytics has never been more important than this year. And I think I'm very looking forward to seeing the draft. I will say that.
Yeah, that's great, Megan, there. So first off, I did notice a couple of St. Lawrence players in some of those figures that were submitted for the Big Data Cup. So that was pretty awesome. And I've got a St. Lawrence women's hockey player here today helping me out, going through the chat and the questions. So she's got a big smile behind her COVID mask.
Perfect.
There. So big shout out to Claire Dudley there. Yeah, I would just echo, I think we're out of questions here and I'm going to wrap it up in a minute, but I just want to echo that point about how small the differences are at the NHL level between teams, and that just the further you get from the NHL, the wider the gap in the teams levels there. I think that's
absolutely. And before I end too, I want to say a huge shout out to Dom. I've been doing like 2 conferences a day this week. So thank you so much for helping me not only pick a topic, but getting some slides together. And Mirnaz, who helped me with I wanted that Austin Matthews example, and she got me it. So we have a really wonderful team at Stathletes, and I am literally nothing without them. So all the credit for the work. And I mean, they could answer your questions way better than I could. And I think that's the thing about being an entrepreneur is you hire way more smarter people than yourselves, and great things happen. So again, appreciate it, Michael, for the time. I hope people enjoyed the keynote, and it's just a wonderful event.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Appreciate it. I think we're going to take about maybe about a 1-minute break here. Give Megan a chance to rest and catch her breath. And then we will come back with our next session.